If you've heard historians say, of course Jesus existed, historians agree, this video is certainly for you, because that claim isn't as settled as you've been led to believe. In this video, I want to take you inside Carrier's most provocative comparison. We'll see why he says we have better historical proof for people like Spartacus, Socrates, and even a Jewish high priest named Caiaphas than we do for Jesus, and how historians normally decide these questions. And when push comes to shove, is this actually about Jesus at all? Or is it more about a body buried in Jerusalem? Okay, take a look at this clip.
Jesus exists. Despite recent declines in the belief that Jesus was a real historical person, according to a 2022 report entitled Talking Jesus, there is no serious historian who denies his existence. Agnostic New Testament scholar Bart Ehrman, for example, writes, Jesus certainly existed, as virtually every competent scholar of antiquity, Christian and non-Christian, agrees. In fact, Ehrman here is giving voice to the scholarly consensus that Jesus existed, and you can see this on your screen as well. When historians, many of them not Christians, examine the sources, there is a striking convergence. As renowned agnostic New Testament scholar E.P. Sanders highlights, there is no substantial doubt about the general course of Jesus' life, when and where he lived, approximately when and where he died, and the sort of thing he did during his public activity. We know that Jesus really was born in 4 BC, as the Christmas story claims, near the death of Herod the Great and in the region that the Gospels describe. And Sanders, alongside scores of other scholars, are confident that we could actually know a great deal more about the historical Jesus, as you can see on this slide. Now, to be clear, the historical method cannot prove the miraculous. That is outside its scope and power as a methodology. But remember, if God exists, then the miraculous is at least possible. And if in addition we have historically reliable testimony, which in the case of Jesus we do, then the Christmas story becomes all the more plausible.
What did you think of that? You convinced? In Dr. Carrier's recent book, The Obsolete Paradigm of the Historical Jesus, Carrier draws interesting contrasts between Jesus and other individuals who have lived around the same time as he did during the era of the late Roman Republic and the Roman Empire. One such person is the slave gladiator and rebel leader, Spartacus. He was said to be a Thracian from around modern-day Bulgaria, who led a slave revolt in southern Italy between 73 BCE and 71 BCE. This conflict, known as the Third Servile War, was an extremely dangerous moment in the history of the Roman Republic, one of which the city of Rome was briefly under threat of being attacked by a large slave army. What Carrier notes is that there is a genuinely striking amount of contemporary or near-contemporary accounts which attest to the life of Spartacus. For instance, the Roman historian Sallust, who was a child when the Third Servile War took place, refers to it, as does another contemporary, the Roman politician and philosopher Cicero. Sallust also later served in the Senate and would have known senators there who were grown men already when Spartacus led his revolt in southern Italy. And there are many other histories and writings that mention Spartacus and his rebellion, from the Roman polymath Varro, another contemporary witness to these events, to later writers like the Greco-Roman biographer Plutarch, who wrote extensively on Spartacus in his life of Marcus Crassus, the Roman politician who suppressed the revolt. There is no denying that Spartacus existed. All of this, Carrier notes, is in sharp contrast to the lack of contemporary references to Jesus Christ. Carrier extends this argument out by comparing the evidence of Jesus' life with the source material from many other ancient Greek figures from the Greek and Roman world. Here I want to take a look at this argument in detail and to see what it reveals about whether there really was a historical Jesus. So what is Carrier's argument? He notes that basically when it comes to other ancient characters from the era of the Greco-Roman history around the Mediterranean, there is generally much more evidence than there is for Jesus to substantiate their existence. For instance, a historicist argument that claims that Jesus unquestionably existed would state that the documentary evidence for the existence of Jesus Christ is very similar to the kind of evidence we have for the existence of Roman emperors. Enemies of Rome like Spartacus or the Carthaginian general Hannibal, philosophers and religious figures, or indeed people who existed in Judea and within the Jewish communities beyond Judea around the same time as Jesus. However, Carrier questions whether this is really the case. To quote, he states in the Obsolete Paradigm that when we actually check why we believe that other person existed, we always find evidence that had warranted our belief, and of a kind that simply has no counterpart in the case of Jesus. Carrier also asserts that certain types of text should be given credence over others. For instance, for Carrier, the Gospels cannot be considered as a legitimate historical source to prove the existence of Jesus, as something like the writings of Sallust or Cicero to prove the existence of Spartacus. It's really important to note that these two were alive when Spartacus's revolt took place, and it would have been the talk of Rome as the slave revolt spread across southern Italy. If Sallust and Cicero were making it up, it sure was an elaborate hoax. So, having established some of the key components of Carrier's arguments in his regard, let's look at some of the ancient historical figures he looks at to see what the credibility of these assertions are. One category of historical figures from the ancient world that can be compared with Jesus are philosophers and religious figures. For instance, Carrier takes the example of the 5th century BCE Athenian philosopher Socrates. He notes that there is much more substantial evidence for the life of Socrates than there is for Jesus. The clearest examples are the many dialogues of Socrates' leading pupil, Plato. Socrates features as a character in many of Plato's dialogues. Some of these are historical documents. For instance, 4 of these dialogues, the Apology, Crito, Euthyphro and the Phaedo, are based on real historical events concerning Socrates' arrest and trial by the government of Athens. While some of the dialogue in them is clearly an invention, Plato was basing these texts on things that we can reasonably be sure that happened, whereas some of the other Platonic dialogues that Socrates features as a character in are clearly complete inventions, where Socrates is simply being used as a literary character by Plato. This aside, Socrates' existence is attested to by many other contemporary writers. For instance, another of his pupils, Xenophon, also wrote about him, while Aristophanes, an Athenian comic playwright, wrote a satirical account of Socrates, and Carrier might have a strong argument here, though he possibly goes astray in suggesting that other works like Diogenes' biographical compendium of the lives of ancient Greek philosophers is a substantial source for proving the existence of Socrates and other ancient Greek philosophers. Diogenes' work is widely understood to be unreliable in terms of its accuracy. He invented outlandish stories about dozens of individual philosophers and clearly had an eye on more of a dramatic story than a form of historical accuracy. Yet the evidence of Plato, Xenophon and Aristophanes taken together is more substantial than anything we have about Jesus. These individuals knew Socrates, lived in Athens during the time, and wrote first-hand accounts of him. And nothing comparable really exists for Jesus, other than perhaps the epistles of St. Peter, although the authenticity of these is open to doubt too, the letters of St. Paul, at least a handful of them that were genuinely authored by Paul. And some would say they are not reliable accounts to prove his existence in the same way that the dialogues of Plato's or the works of Xenophon and Aristophanes prove the existence of Socrates. Carrier continues his argument by comparing the evidence for the existence of Jesus with the evidence of Alexander the Great, or the Roman emperors themselves. This argument, it must be said, kind of writes itself. For instance, as Carrier notes, we have abundant contemporary coins, inscriptions, tablets, and other physical objects from and about Alexander the Great. We even have the de facto death certificate, the original printed in clay from the archives of Persia. Beyond this, there are histories of Alexander's life and conquests, while there are abundant biographical studies and histories of the reigns of the Roman emperors by Suetonius, Tacitus, and Cassius Dio, and the anonymous authors of the Historia Augusta. There are templates, buildings, inscriptions, and coins from all around the Roman world attesting to the existence of people like Caesar, Augustus, Nero, Trajan, and Commodus. In the case of Marcus Aurelius, we even have a work by him, his Meditations, while Nero, before he became a supposed tyrant in the mid-60s CE, built up a significant literary circle around him, which included figures like the philosopher and political writer Seneca, who wrote about him. There is absolutely no denying that these individuals existed. What do you think? All of this being said, it should be caveated that there is much less certainty about whether the details of the lives of these rulers are accurate, while there is no denying that Alexander the Great existed. Can we really trust everything written by Arrian in his Anabasis of Alexander? It might be the most detailed account of his conquest of the Persian Empire and campaign into India, but Arrian was writing over 400 years after Alexander's time. Most historians today would also agree that Suetonius peppered his biographies of emperors like Tiberius, Caligula, Nero, and Domitian with biased stories and fabrications to make these rulers look worse than they possibly were in actuality. The same is true in much subtle ways of Tacitus. Thus, while Carrier is right to suggest that there is much more abundant evidence for the existence of figures like Alexander the Great and the Roman emperors than there is for Jesus Christ, that doesn't necessarily mean that some of these sources aren't widely inaccurate in the stories that they tell or the picture they present of these rulers. Probably the most convincing comparison that Carrier makes is between Jesus and Caiaphas. Caiaphas was the high priest of the Temple of Jerusalem in Jesus' time. He is mentioned in some of the canonical Gospels and other early Christian texts, especially in the context of the arrest and trial of Jesus. For instance, in the Gospel of Matthew, it is stated that those who had arrested Jesus led him away to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were gathered together. Matthew 26:57. Now, clearly it would not make sense for Carrier to use the New Testament references to substantiate the existence of Caiaphas, while simultaneously trying to suggest that there is a plausible argument that Jesus never actually existed. But Carrier notes that there is a lot of other contemporaneous evidence for the existence of a historical Caiaphas. For instance, we have extensive accounts of him in the writings of Josephus, as well as in later rabbinical writings. Most importantly, an inscribed casket containing the remains of a high priest named Caiaphas from the 1st century CE was found in a burial cave in southern Jerusalem in 1990. As such, we have literal burial remains of Caiaphas to attest his existence. The same cannot be said for Jesus. Although various theories have been put forward over the years about where the cave he was allegedly entombed in is located, there is zero evidence to support any of these theories, and early Christian texts don't even agree on whether Jesus was buried or entombed after he was crucified. So what does all of this mean when it comes to establishing the historicity or mythical nature of Jesus Christ? it doesn't prove beyond all doubt that Jesus never existed. Carrier is the first to admit this in the Obsolete Paradigm and in his earlier writings. However, what it does do is chip further away at the evidential basis for asserting that Jesus must have existed. And it probably goes without saying that there is a lot more evidence to support the existence of people like Alexander the Great and the Roman emperors than there is of the existence of Jesus. What is much more striking is how much clear contemporaneous evidence there is for the existence of people like Spartacus, Socrates, Caiaphas, by comparison with the lack of contemporary references to Jesus. The vast majority of supposed evidence for Jesus from Roman and Jewish historians and writers like Tacitus, Josephus, and Pliny the Younger, or indeed from the Gospels and early Christian Apocrypha, was written long after Jesus' time. This doesn't prove Jesus didn't exist, but it should give us a pause for thought. So what do you think? Do you think, on balance, that Jesus existed, or does Carrier's argument undermine the case for a historical Jesus? Let me know in the comments. I will be looking at the other side of the argument, but thanks for watching. I appreciate it. Catch you in the next one.
God complex. Haters love to hate, but I never feel pressed. Got a lot on my plate, but I never get stressed.